I don't know about you, but I've been reflecting these last few weeks, or a couple of months now, isn't it, on the various times that people in the Bible and in Christian history have found themselves either in isolation or lockdown. And I've really been struck by the sheer numbers of them who experienced that in the Bible and in Christian history. We've talked about some of them already. I was a bit worried I'd end up running out of them before the end of lockdown, but I think there are going to be quite a few more. So, and today, sorry, the other thing I've been struck by as well is how God worked in them in those times. So the experience of isolation and, for many, lockdown has been an experience that many Christians have experienced down through the centuries. Many of God's people experienced in the Bible. And when we look at what happened in those times, extraordinary things came out of them. Bibles got translated, people were changed, the church was reformed, and people encountered God in all sorts of different ways. And my prayer, in a sense, for us in lockdown is that we do, as we talked about the other week when we talked about Philemon, is that we encounter God afresh in this time, in a time when we can't do some of the things we normally do. It's quite interesting that those of us who are more introverted probably feel more comfortable in this world than some of those who are more extrovert, but everybody faces different types of stress as we walk through this. And it was really helpful, I thought, last week just to hear from Dawn on how we manage ourselves in this. And if you didn't hear that, it is available as a talk on its own on our YouTube channel, so feel free to go and have a look at that if you couldn't make it. So this week I want to look briefly at someone who experienced lockdown or isolation twice in his life, who knew what it was to have his hopes dashed, who expected to be out of lockdown and wasn't, and who still allowed his gifts to function in that setting and found a place of fruitfulness in that lockdown, and who also gives us, I think, a perspective on evil things happening to us. And that person is Joseph in the Old Testament. We read about the story of Joseph. If you want to look it up in the Bible afterwards, we read it in Genesis 37, chapter 37 through to, particularly I'm going to focus on the chapters through to 41, but really right through to the end of Genesis is talking about the life of Joseph right through to chapter 50. It's actually labeled in our Bibles as the account of Jacob, but who was his father. But a great deal of it is actually about Joseph. And Joseph is one of 12 sons. Jacob had 12 sons. They became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is his father's favorite son, and he does perhaps let this go to his head a bit. He also has a remarkable gift from God, and where God is able to speak to him through dreams, and he's also able to interpret the dreams of other people. And after he has a couple of dreams, which are basically about him ruling over his brothers get pretty fed up with him, quite frankly, and eventually they come up with a plan to get rid of him. And to cut a long story short, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, who take his coat, we've all seen the musical, I'm sure, to show their father as evidence that he's died. So if you think you've got a dysfunctional family, if your brothers and sisters haven't taken your favorite coat and dipped it in blood to try and persuade your dad that you're dead, you're not as dysfunctional as Joseph's family. But he's sold to be a slave to a man called Potiphar, where he quickly, and Potiphar is the captain of the guard of Pharaoh's guard in Egypt. And in Potiphar's household, Joseph quickly rises to become the most valuable and trusted member of the entire household. And everything's going well. So having been left in a ditch, basically, or in a well by his brothers, Joseph rises out of that one, and you think, okay, it must all be downhill now, but it's not. It gets worse. So Potiphar's wife makes a series of, or makes a particular false allegation against him, and he ends up in prison. So having been dumped in a ditch by his brothers, his brothers who've told his father that he's dead, he now finds himself in an Egyptian prison. And Potiphar, we're told, was the captain of the Pharaoh's guard, and Joseph's thrown into prison, which was in the house of the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. So Joseph finds himself in prison in the very house over which he's been the kind of chief steward and trusted servant. So Joseph ends up once again in isolation and now in lockdown as well. And in prison, and there's a pattern here in Joseph's life, because in prison, he once again becomes the most trusted prisoner, once again finding favor with those he's among. You know, Joseph, I don't know what it was about him, but everywhere he went, he became the most trusted person there. And the captain of the guard, which is presumably Potiphar, is suddenly one day a couple of Pharaoh's servants who've really upset Pharaoh are handed over to Potiphar to put in prison because they've upset Pharaoh. And they are Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. I don't know who was testing his wine for poison while the cupbearer was in prison, or who was baking his bread, but both his cupbearer and his baker end up in prison. And after a while, both of these guys have dreams on the same night, and Joseph interprets them for them. The cupbearer's dream, he says, means that the cupbearer is going to be restored to his previous position and freed. And the baker thinks, oh, that's great. I'll tell him about my dream. I'll have some of that. So the baker tells him about his dream. And Joseph says, yeah, your dream means you're going to be hanged and executed, which is not quite such good news. So after 3 days, of course, the cupbearer is freed and the baker is executed. And the cupbearer, when he's freed, makes a promise to Joseph, or Joseph asks him to make a promise that when he's freed, he'll remember Joseph, because Joseph, of course, has been wrongfully imprisoned, and he really wants the cupbearer to speak up on his behalf. So the cupbearer, of course, is freed. And what does he do? He promptly forgets all about Joseph. So Joseph, having had this hope that he's going to be freed soon and the cupbearer will put in a good word for him, the cupbearer goes back to life as normal and promptly forgets about poor old Joseph, who has another couple of years rotting in prison. But at the end of that couple of years, Pharaoh himself has a dream. Pharaoh's basically the king of Egypt. He has a perplexing dream, and he goes around all of his wise men and all of his dream interpreters and all of the professionals, and he asks them, well, what's this dream mean that I've had? None of them can interpret that dream, not one of them. And suddenly you can just imagine the scene, the cupbearer sitting there when Pharaoh's saying, who's going to interpret this dream for me? And suddenly the cupbearer goes, it was Joseph, wasn't it? And he goes and he apologizes to Pharaoh for having forgotten about Joseph. And Joseph is pulled out of prison. They wash him up a bit, clean him, give him a shave, and tidy him up, because they don't want to bring a stinking, dirty guy in front of the Pharaoh. And of course, he manages to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. So Joseph once again has made this remarkable transition, because not only does he interpret Pharaoh's dream, but Pharaoh basically says, well, if you're so good at interpreting this dream and you understand what it's all about, and my land is going to have a 7-year period of plenty and then a 7-year famine, sounds to me like you're the guy to put in charge of it all. So Joseph, from being a prisoner, suddenly finds himself as the Prime Minister of Egypt, basically. And he he ends up as prime minister. Now, we've probably all heard the story, or maybe even seen the musical, which isn't always that faithful to the story. But I think there are a number of things that come out of this narrative for us. And there are a number of things that in time of lockdown, we can, I think we can draw from it. Not a huge number, but I think there is some encouragement for us in this story. So the first one, I think, is, and we talked about this previously during lockdown, is that Joseph managed to find a place of fruitfulness in whatever situation he found himself in. He was, when he was in prison, he managed to make himself useful in the prison. Well, first of all, actually, when he was a slave, he became the most trusted member of Potiphar's household. He was clearly a very capable administrator. And even as a slave who'd been sold by his brothers, he still managed to find a place of fruitfulness, a place of effectiveness, and a place of usefulness. He still experienced God working in his life. And then when he was thrown into prison, Joseph still manages to find a place of usefulness and fruitfulness and effectiveness. He becomes the most trusted prisoner. He's put in charge of it doesn't say he's put in charge of it. It says he attends the cupbearer and the baker while they're in prison. And the jailer leans on Joseph and finds him very helpful and useful. So Joseph manages to find this place of fruitfulness and effectiveness, not in a contrived way, but he just carries on being the person God made him to be. And because of that, God moves in his life. We don't know how long Joseph was in prison for. Some people, I was listening to someone the other day who categorically said it was 13 years. Actually, we do not know. We have no idea. If we assume he was about 17 when he went to Egypt, we know that it says in Genesis 40 that he was 30 when he just after he was freed from prison. So there's a period there probably of about 13 years, but we don't know how much of it he was in Potiphar's house for. We don't know how long it took him to become the head of Potiphar's household effectively. So we really don't know how long he was in prison, but I suspect it was quite some time. Certainly at least 2 years, because it's 2 years between the cupbearer being freed and Pharaoh having his dream. So, you and I have had 9 weeks of lockdown, and some of us are tearing our hair out already. Joseph actually was probably in prison for a number of years, although we don't know quite how many. But whether it's in slavery or in prison, he somehow, by being the person God made him to be, finds that place of fruitfulness and effectiveness and seeing God's purposes worked out in his life. And I think the second thing I see in this narrative of Joseph is that God is able to make any situation that you or I find ourselves in a place where we can live fruitfully for him. I think many of us have been surprised at the amount we are still able to be involved in, to accomplish and to see done while we're in lockdown. And that's not to say we should all be furiously trying to get a whole lot done. Actually, God has a different calling on each of us. And for each of us, we are called, as Sue said earlier, to be the people God created us to be, to derive pleasure and to see God, or see God's pleasure in those things he's gifted us and equipped us to do. And I just love the way that God finds ways in Joseph's life of still using him, still touching the lives of other people, and still advancing his purposes, whatever happens to Joseph, whether it's in slavery or in prison or wherever it might be. And then the other thing I noticed this week as I was thinking about Joseph was that he has this experience where the cupbearer has promised him that, yeah, I'll tell Pharaoh about you, don't worry. and Joseph thinks he's going to be out of it in a week or two, probably. But actually, he has another 2 years. He experiences having to handle disappointment on top of the loss that he's already experienced. He has to handle that loss of hope while he is in jail. And I think there's something incredible in that, in the way that Joseph manages to handle disappointment and still come out of it worshiping God and praising God. There is, at the end of the whole episode, there's a remarkable time where his brothers come to him and, quite rightly, apologize for what they did to him. And Joseph comes out with this amazing statement. He says, you intended it for evil, but God, sorry, you meant it for evil, but God intended it for good. And that's quite a perspective to have when you've spent years in prison, you've been a slave, yet to be able to say to those who put you there, well, you meant it for evil, but God intended it for good. And I think one of the ways I've been looking at this whole situation the last month or so is that actually, yes, there is something evil and wrong happening with this virus. You know, it is terrible when hundreds and thousands of people now are dying. But actually, although it was meant for evil, God intended it for good. And in it, God is going to work for good. That doesn't mean that God's behind the coronavirus. I don't personally believe that he is. But in it, he is working for good for you and for me. And my prayer really is that each of us can be like Joseph in the midst of that and say, well, Lord, how are you going to bring good out of this in my life? And Lord, how should I live in this situation? How do I carry on working out what it is that you've called me to do and who you've called me to be in the midst of this? We're not called to be people who are productivity mad and try and get as much done as we possibly can. At the same time, we're not called just to lie in bed doing nothing for 9 weeks. I don't think any of us have done that. But we are called to be God's people in the midst of this and to continue our walk with God and to find a place of fruitfulness in the situation in which he has placed us for these last 9 weeks and for however much longer it lasts. And my prayer for myself and for us as a church is that we be those fruitful people during that time, not by squeezing out fruit, but by bearing fruit, by walking with the Spirit day by day and week by week. And we find the grace to do that in Jesus. Jesus came to give you and me life and to give us life in all its fullness. And he can do that, whether it's in lockdown, in isolation, in difficult circumstances. And I know many in the church are experiencing very difficult circumstances at the moment. But we in Jesus have a hope that doesn't disappoint. And Joseph had a hope that didn't leave him disappointed. So I just want to encourage us today to be people who are looking to God for that place of, where do I find fruitfulness in all of this, Lord? What are you going to do in my life in however long of this remains? I don't think many of us would want to go through this experience again. And if we don't want to go through it again, I think it's a good thing if we seek to learn what we can while we are going through it, because it's certainly not a mountain I want to have to go around again. So let's be people who find a place of fruitfulness, find a place of God's rest in the midst of all of this, but also allow him to work out in our lives what it is that he's calling us to do in these remaining however many weeks it might be. I don't know about